Hello, today is Monday, November 14th, 2022. I'm Joe Schmidt from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. On today's podcast, we are going to spend a little time discussing a wireless service, the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, or CBRS. CBRS has drawn little media attention compared to 5G, but it is starting to get some traction with carriers, ISPs, and enterprise customers. CBRS does have a number of legal and perhaps a few technical issues, so I am very fortunate to have a couple of smart guys with me to take a closer look at this. Steve Rosen, a partner at LB3, and TC2's technology director, David Lee. Hey guys, thanks for joining me today. David, let me start with you. We've covered 5G on a few podcasts over the last year, but CBRS probably isn't quite as familiar to folks. And to be honest, David, the name sounds a lot like the CB radios that were all the rage in the 70s, but I'm assuming that this is a different service?
Yes, Joe, and good morning. I'm reading you 5x5, by the way, while I watch reruns of Smokey and the Bandit. But actually, seriously, other than the Citizens in the CBRS name, the service has nothing in common with CB radio, which was authorized by the FCC in the 1940s. CBRS, which was first authorized by the FCC 7 years ago in 2015, and then was fully authorized for commercial service 2.5 years ago in early 2020, is one of the first services to be licensed in the sweet spot of the mid-band spectrum of 3.5 gigahertz. We call this 3.5 gigahertz spectrum the sweet spot as it strikes a nice balance of propagation, meaning propagation inside buildings as well as outdoors, outside of buildings, and data capacity. It has proven very useful for both voice and data applications. Some examples of those use cases in the carrier and internet service provider side include mobile broadband, fixed wireless access for carrier backhaul, as well as local access. And for enterprises, there are private deployments, CBRS for short-haul radio access, IoT in-building connectivity, such as warehouses, communications across large transportation hubs. And the industries run the gamut, including healthcare, education, transportation, and manufacturing.
Wow, that sounds pretty powerful. So, Steve, like the old CBs, can you just take the equipment out of the box, install it in your big rig, and start transmitting?
Hey, Joe. Good to be with you again, and I'm going to give you a lawyer's answer to your question, which is yes and no. First, users need to recognize that CBRS is a licensed service, but a lightly regulated one. Or CBRS sits somewhere between the unlicensed world of Wi-Fi and the tightly regulated mobile operator-controlled world of 4G and 5G. For CBRS, there are two classes of license: priority access licenses, PALs, and general authorized access, GAA. In addition, there are incumbent access users in this spectrum: the U.S. Navy, fixed satellite, and legacy wireless ISPs that were previously granted exclusive use of this spectrum. The CBRS allows more efficient use of spectrum by making it available when not being used by these incumbent users. Both types of licenses are authorized to transmit and receive at any given location and over the same set of frequencies as assigned by a Spectrum Access System or SAS administrator. However, PAL operations receive protection from GAA operations, while GAA users receive no interference protection.
So let me see if I'm keeping up. One type of license provides transmission protection, but the other doesn't.
Yes, that's right. Consistent with the fact that they receive interference protection, PALs are assigned by competitive bidding for each county and are valid for 10-year renewable license terms. On the other hand, GAAs are licensed by rule. Users of GAA devices can begin operations without filing a formal FCC license application. That said, the restrictions on both PAL and GAA are similar, and that both classes of licensee must comply with the CBRS service rules contained in Part 96 of the Commission's rules. This includes the rules related to license eligibility and authorization, protection of incumbent access users against interference, and technical characteristics of the CBRS devices called CBSDs, including power limitations, registration requirements, geolocation requirements, security requirements, antenna requirements, and certain professional installation requirements.
Okay, so whether you are a GAA or a PAL, you can't just set up your equipment and start operations because you need to coordinate with an SAS administrator. So, David, how exactly does that work?
That's interesting, Joe. We're getting to some details here. In order to allow CBRS users to share spectrum to the greatest extent possible without interfering with one another or incumbents' access users, the FCC's rules require all CBRS devices to be registered with any one of 6 SAS administrators, including Google, CommScope, Sony, Keybridge, Amdocs, and Federated Wireless. These SAS administrators operate cloud-based frequency coordination systems that prevent interference by allocating channels and power levels based on which other GAA and PAL users are operating in the same geographic area, and that could be even much smaller than a U.S. county. And note that the same SAS administrators generally charge a fee for their services. As a side note, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, or NIST, located in Gaithersburg, Maryland, and the FCC partnered to ensure the radio power levels and surveillance and monitoring systems were properly engineered to ensure the U.S. Navy radar and other incumbent access users will not be interfered. Interestingly, you go to the NIST website and review some of the award-winning peer-reviewed papers.
Hey, thanks for that, David. That is a great way to pack as many users as possible into a small amount of spectrum. So what kind of devices are used for doing all of this transmitting and receiving?
Well, Joe, there are 2 types of Citizens Broadband Radio Service devices, Category A devices and Category B. Category A devices consist of low-power devices like small cells deployed indoor or at street level. To avoid potential interference, Category A devices may not be deployed or operated outdoors with antennas exceeding 6 meters. On the other hand, Category B devices are higher power devices that are limited to outdoor deployments and must be installed professionally.
Other than operating a CBSD in compliance with the FCC's service rules, Steve, are there any other regulatory issues?
Definitely, Joe. If an entity uses its CBRS to provide carrier-like services, such as 5G voice and data services to the general public, it will be regulated by the FCC as a wireless common carrier or commercial mobile radio service provider. This carries a pretty heavy regulatory burden, including numerous annual filings and mandatory contributions to the Federal Universal Service Fund. On the other hand, if an entity uses its CBRS to provide services such as IoT to itself or a limited number of customers with which it negotiates custom terms and conditions, it should be lightly regulated as a private mobile radio service provider.
So, David, how about if you tell us about some other business use cases?
Of course, Joe. In addition to the use cases I mentioned in my opening remarks, CBRS opens up this 150 megahertz of valuable spectrum to smaller use cases, such as creating a high-speed secure networks for a hospital or a college campus, factory or stadium, as well as IoT and other machine-to-machine applications.
That's cool. Those are really some pretty interesting applications. So, Steve, being a lawyer amongst us, do you have any cautionary words?
Yes, I do. From a regulatory perspective, users need to make a threshold decision as to whether they would like to assume the legal obligations of becoming either a GAA or PAL licensee, or if they would rather outsource these obligations to their CBS provider and buy a CBS provider as a fully bundled service, CBRS as a service. As always, there are puts and takes to this decision, as owners and licensees of CBRS networks retain a greater degree of control over their service, but must balance that control against the responsibilities that come with FCC rule compliance as a licensee.
And Joe, I have some optimistic words from a business perspective. CBRS really enables entrepreneurs to experiment with new business models for mobile network without first having to raise these huge amounts of capital from auctions for 3G, 4G, 5G, as everyone knows about, that only one of the big 3 mobile operators could afford.
Okay, great stuff. Thank you, David, and thank you, Steve. I had no idea that CBRS was such a capable service for business applications. And, it doesn't surprise me that there are a ton of regulatory considerations. If you'd like to learn more about wireless services, or if you have other ICT needs, You can contact Steve, David, me, or any of our LB3 and TC2 colleagues by giving us a call or just shoot us an email. You can also stay up to date by subscribing to Staying Connected, by checking out our websites, and by following us on LinkedIn.